It wasn't the trial that made them stare, it was the woman they tried to erase. Dressed in black, no makeup, no smile, the woman they once called a workhorse. Today, she would show them. That workhorse bought the house, owned the company, and held the reins of every secret they thought they buried. My name is Camille Prescott, and this is how I turned their insults into an empire. The first time I stepped into the house on Queen Anne Hill, it took my breath away. The floors gleamed like mirrors, the crown molding stretched high above my head, and through the arched windows, Seattle looked like a city made just for us. Brandon had picked the place himself, and I remember thinking how lucky I was that he wanted to build a life with me here. But even then, something didn't sit right. There was no welcome, no warmth in his voice when he handed me the keys. He just said, "You better not hang any of those weird paintings in the main rooms." I laughed it off. I always did in those days. I told myself it was his way, brusque and proud, raised by a woman who measured self-worth in decimal points. Judith Prescott, my mother-in-law, ran the social circuits in the Northwest like a queen on a throne she never earned but guarded fiercely. She met me at the front door with a glass of champagne I hadn't asked for and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You'll get used to it, dear," she said as she gestured toward the grand staircase. "Brandon's always had a vision. Don't get in the way of it and you'll do just fine." That was her welcome. And I took it. I told myself it was just nerves, that the Prescotts were just different from my family who had built their lives out of patience and compromise, not legacy and leverage. Brandon gave me a corner room upstairs, said it could be my studio, but he made it clear that no one from outside would ever see what I painted. That wasn't part of the Prescott brand. He called my work quaint, a hobby, something to keep me from spending too much time shopping. Every month he transferred a fixed amount into my personal account like an allowance for a child. I stopped asking for more after the second argument. "You're like a workhorse, Camille," he said one night after I'd asked if I could invest in a gallery downtown. "You don't complain, you don't ask for much, and you stay in your lane. That's what I need. Not a damn visionary." I remember staring at him across the marble island in our kitchen, the one I wasn't allowed to decorate without clearing it through Judith. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I swallowed it. I always did. "It's just how he talks," I told myself. "He doesn't mean it," but over time I stopped believing that. Words like that don't come from nowhere, they come from belief. And belief, especially when wrapped in money and power, becomes concrete. Judith reinforced it every chance she got. She'd stop by unannounced, her perfume filling the hallways like a warning. If I wore jeans, she'd arch an eyebrow. If I cooked something too simple, she'd suggest a caterer next time. And if I mentioned my art, she'd change the subject faster than Brandon could shut down my questions about the company. "This house is Brandon's," she said once at brunch, even though I had hosted and cooked the entire meal. "It's in his name, of course. That's just how family estates are handled. No offense, dear, but that's why you married up." I smiled through it. I smiled through everything. But inside, something cold started to settle. Not anger exactly, not yet. Just an ache that grew every time someone talked about my life like it belonged to them. Every time Brandon bought something new for himself without asking, while I calculated whether I could order more paint. I kept painting anyway. At night, after they all went to bed or left for charity dinners I was never invited to, I painted in silence, surrounded by the hum of a house that never quite felt like mine. I didn't show anyone what I was making. Not yet. In those early days, I still thought I could earn my place there. That if I played the part long enough, if I was quiet enough, agreeable enough, grateful enough, they would see me as more than just the girl who got lucky. I was wrong. But it would take me years to stop trying. One morning, not long after our third anniversary, I found Judith in the living room directing movers to rearrange the furniture I had chosen for the guest suite. I hadn't been told she was coming. She handed me a swatch of floral fabric and said, "I'm thinking a softer tone in here. Something more Prescott." I didn't argue. I didn't say that I had spent weeks researching that room's design, trying to make it feel welcoming for guests we never had. I just nodded and walked away. I went upstairs, closed the door to my tiny studio, and stared at the unfinished canvas on the easel. It was supposed to be a field of wild horses, but all I could see now was a single figure in the center. A horse, yes, but burden tired, its eyes hollow. I picked up a brush and began again. The paint bled heavy that day, darker than I expected, and somewhere deep in my chest I felt something shift. Not loudly, not with fire. Just a quiet folding and a soft decision. If they were going to treat me like a workhorse, I would learn to pull more than they ever imagined. Most days the house felt like a stage set after everyone had left. Still and curated, stripped of any warmth. Brandon was always traveling, always chasing another deal, another acquisition for Prescott and King. If he was home, it was for just long enough to drop his suit jacket on the arm of the couch, scroll through his phone while I tried to make small talk, and fall asleep without asking me a single question. Sometimes he didn't come home at all. He'd text me from the airport, maybe a brief sorry meeting ran late, staying near the site. Judith filled the silence in his absence. She came by unannounced 3, sometimes 4 times a week. She had her own key. She moved pillows, replaced drapes, adjusted vases, hired people to redo the landscaping without telling me. When I gently asked her to consult me first, she gave me the look I had come to know too well, the one that said she found me amusing in a mildly offensive way. "Camille," she said once, while flipping through a fabric book, "this is a Prescott house. It needs a Prescott's eye. Don't take it personally, you're doing beautifully with the flowers." She always managed to make her condescension sound like a compliment, and like a fool I kept trying to please her. Before I married Brandon, I had worked as a UX designer for a tech startup in San Diego. I loved it. I loved solving problems, creating clarity in chaos. My team respected me, my ideas mattered, and I had built a small but growing reputation in the field. But when Brandon proposed, he suggested I take a breath from the tech world. Said it would be a better look for the Prescott family if his wife focused on more elevated pursuits. I remember the way he said it, like he was offering me a gift. I remember saying yes, even though something inside me whispered no. I quit. Moved to Seattle. Packed away my portfolio and told myself I was trading up. That marriage, stability, legacy, all those big words were worth more than code and coffee-fueled design sprints. But slowly I began to realize I had disappeared. I went weeks without being called by my name. Judith called me dear or darling, or simply didn't address me at all. Brandon rarely used my name unless he was annoyed. I felt like I was watching my own life from the far corner of a room, blurry and quiet. I stopped looking at myself in the mirror, stopped wearing makeup, stopped checking my email. Nobody was writing to me anyway. One night, after Brandon had canceled dinner for the 3rd time that week, and Judith had sent over a decorator to redo the guest bath without warning, I sat on the floor of the studio room. I stared at my old sketchbooks, most of them untouched since we moved in. My fingers hovered over the spine of one before I pulled it into my lap and flipped to a blank page. The pencil felt awkward at first. My lines were shaky, uncertain, like a language I used to speak but had forgotten. But then something clicked. I started sketching without thinking. Shapes turned into shadows, shadows into figures. By midnight, I had filled half the book. My hands were cramped, but my chest felt lighter. The next morning, I ordered a digital tablet under a guest name and had it delivered to the back gate. I told the staff it was for a friend staying over. No one asked questions. That night, I downloaded software, reactivated an old account I used in college, and set up a new profile with no link to my real name. I called it Astro Wilder. It sounded like someone who belonged in a different world. I created quietly. Every night I climbed the stairs after the house had gone still, sat at the tablet with headphones in, and let the silence guide me. I drew versions of myself I didn't recognize, women with wings, faces made of fractured glass, wild horses running through fire. I posted them anonymously, no bio, no face. Just art. At first, no one noticed. A few likes. 1 or 2 reposts. But then a collector reached out. They wanted to buy one of my pieces. I thought it was a scam. I didn't answer for 2 days. Then they sent a formal offer through an official platform with a verified account and a deposit attached. $10,000. For a single piece. I stared at the screen for what felt like an hour. My hands shook as I accepted. I sent the files, processed the transaction, and watched the money land in an account I had set up months earlier, more out of instinct than plan. When it cleared, I sat back and cried. Not from joy exactly. Not even from relief. From recognition. Someone out there had seen something I made and thought it was worth something. They didn't know my name, my face, my connection to any legacy. Just the art. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Brandon slept beside me, snoring lightly, his face peaceful and untouched by doubt. I turned to look at him once, wondering how we got here, how I had folded myself so small to fit into his world. I didn't hate him. Not yet. I just didn't know who he was anymore. Or who I was with him. The next morning I made eggs and toast like nothing had changed, but everything had. I had tasted something I hadn't in years. Freedom. It hadn't always been a fairy tale. Even before the wedding, there were cracks that I tried to patch over with hope and excuses. When Brandon first brought up the prenup, he did it over dinner at a steakhouse in downtown Seattle. He handed me a folder between courses like it was a menu. "It's standard," he said, barely looking at me. "Just legal stuff." My mother insisted. "You get it right." I didn't answer right away. I stared at the papers, skimming the dense paragraphs. Everything about it was skewed. No joint ownership of assets. No rights to the house we would live in. No share in the company's growth, no matter how long we stayed married. It outlined an allowance. The word actually appeared in writing. Like I was being adopted. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, but I didn't show it. Not then. I took the folder home and stared at it for hours, unable to sleep. The next morning I called someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Malcolm Green had been my father's closest friend before Dad passed. He had known me since I was 10, sent me birthday cards every year even after we lost touch. He was a lawyer, sharp and subtle with a mind that moved like water through stone. When I told him what Brandon had given me, he didn't react right away. "You want to sign it?" he asked gently. "I don't know," I said. I think I don't have a choice." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You always have a choice, Camille. Even if you think you don't." He looked over the agreement that night. Then he called me again. "It's a fortress," he said. But there's one thing he didn't think about. If you're bringing assets into the marriage or earning anything independently during, that's still yours if we outline it properly. We can draft an addendum. Quietly. He won't even notice unless he reads every page. And if he does, then you'll know exactly what kind of man you're marrying. I hesitated. Malcolm didn't push. He sent over the revised document with the addendum included. It was simple, just 2 pages. It stated that any assets acquired through my personal creative or professional work would remain solely mine. It was fair. Barely a shield, but enough for someone like me to stand behind if everything went wrong. I handed the papers back to Brandon a few days later. He barely looked at them before sending them to his family's attorney. Judith sent me a bouquet of white roses the next day with a note that said, "Welcome to the Prescott legacy." I kept Malcolm's card tucked in the back of my wallet just in case. After we married, I played the role they wrote for me. I smiled at fundraisers. I learned to make conversation about things I didn't care about. I dressed the part. I listened more than I spoke. But I never forgot what I signed. Over time, I developed habits that looked ordinary from the outside but were rooted in preparation. I kept records of everything. Every receipt, every bill, every transaction Brandon made that I had access to. If he mentioned a business deal, I wrote it down. If Judith gave me instructions, I followed them and then noted the time, date, and details in a small notebook I kept hidden in a hollow book on the shelf. Emails. Call logs. Bank statements. I didn't know exactly what I was gathering at first, just that it felt necessary. Brandon rarely noticed. He was always busy. Always on the phone, flying to Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, chasing numbers and partners and meetings. He never questioned where I was or what I did as long as dinner was warm and the house stayed perfect. One afternoon, 6 months into the marriage, I asked him about a joint account. "Just a suggestion," I said. "Something we could both access for the house for vacations, emergencies." He didn't even look up from his phone. You've got your allowance, don't you? That word again. I felt something twist in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I just nodded and went back to cleaning the counter that was already spotless. That night, I opened a new bank account in my name only. I linked it to the email I had created for Astra Wilder. I made sure it was connected to nothing else. When I made my first digital sale 2 years later, I transferred the funds into that account. $10,000, then 15, then 32. The numbers climbed slowly, then steadily. I sold to collectors in Tokyo, Berlin, New York. I negotiated licenses with music producers, signed contracts with small gaming companies looking for evocative visuals. All under Astra Wilder. Every dollar was logged, copied, printed, and stored. I bought external drives, encrypted backups, even mailed copies to a rented P.O. box in Tacoma. I wasn't paranoid. I was precise. To the world, I was still Camille Prescott, the quiet wife of a real estate magnate. The one who made perfect tea and smiled at the right times. To Judith, I was still just lucky to be included. But behind that curated image, something entirely different was unfolding. A life that was mine alone. A body of work that carried no last name, no social obligation, no legacy but my own. There were days I felt like I was living 2 separate lives. In the morning I arranged flowers. Judith sent over from the market planned menus for dinners Brandon would probably miss. In the evenings, I created worlds. I drew things that frightened me, empowered me, things I couldn't say out loud. I watched my anonymous followers grow. Watched the value of my work climb with every repost, every review, every quiet message of admiration from people I'd never met. They didn't know who I was, but they saw me, and that somehow made all the difference. One night Brandon returned from a week-long trip in New York. He looked tired, annoyed. He tossed his bag onto the couch and loosened his tie. "We need to talk about expenses," he said. "The heating bill was ridiculous last month. And you're going through grocery money like we have 6 people in the house." I said nothing. Just nodded. He really looked at me for the first time in weeks. "Are you even listening?" I smiled softly. "Always." Then I excused myself, walked upstairs, and locked the studio door behind me. The screen glowed with a message from an agent in London. They wanted to feature Astra Wilder in an upcoming digital exhibition. The offer included a 5-figure commission and global streaming rights. I stared at the message, my fingers trembling. Then I opened the notebook from the hollow book and wrote down the date, the time, the details. If this was a game, I was done playing defense. I started watching him more closely after that night. Not with suspicion, exactly, not at first. It was more like curiosity. Like I was studying an animal that had always roamed in and out of the house without much notice, but now I wanted to understand the pattern of its movements. Brandon's travel schedule had gotten more erratic. He was in Miami every other week, sometimes for 2 or 3 nights, and the reasons changed each time. Site inspections, investor meetings, strategic partnerships. The words meant nothing. I nodded through them, smiled when he kissed my cheek goodbye, and wrote every detail down in the black notebook I kept tucked behind the mirror in my studio. One evening after he left for what he called a last-minute meeting in Dallas, I checked our shared financial dashboard. He didn't know I still had access. He thought he had locked me out a year ago when he switched everything to a new advisor, but I had learned long ago to keep a few digital doors open. I didn't find Dallas. I found Miami. A wire transfer for $1.6 million. The recipient was a real estate management firm based in Coral Gables. The memo field read build-out deposit, and the source account wasn't one of the main Prescott and King accounts. It was a subsidiary. I didn't recognize one that had only existed for 7 months. I copied everything. Screenshots, timestamps, routing numbers. I traced the LLC through a chain of holding companies until I landed on a name that made my throat go dry. Sienna Locke. I had met her once. A blonde in her early 30s with sharp red nails and a voice like syrup. She was Brandon's new executive assistant, hired barely 6 months earlier. I remembered the way she shook my hand at a charity event, the way she smiled at Brandon like they shared a private joke. "He's brilliant," she said to me, touching his arm just a little too long. "I've never met anyone with such vision." And I had smiled like I always did and excused myself to check on the silent auction. Now her name was tied to a Miami penthouse registered to a shell company connected to Brandon's business. I didn't need to guess what it meant. The numbers spoke for themselves. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream or cry or pack a bag. I went back upstairs, opened my tablet, and started drawing. That night I created a piece I called The Chasm. It showed two cliffs split by fire with a woman standing on one side, her face half in shadow. I posted it at midnight, and by morning it had been purchased by a collector in Berlin for $47,000. That was the first time I bought one of my own pieces. It felt strange at first, self-dealing artificial inflation, but I wasn't doing it to scam anyone. I was playing a game that had been stacked against me since the beginning. If Brandon could funnel money through holding companies, then so could I. If he could make Sienna into a hidden expense, I could turn Astor Wilder into a brand. I created multiple wallets, each registered under a different alias, each seeded with just enough ETH to make them look legitimate. I purchased a few pieces at rising prices, then let others join in. The attention grew fast. The art world loves a mystery. Who is Astor Wilder? Is she an AI, a collective, a ghost? No one guessed it was the quiet wife of Brandon Prescott, hidden away in a mansion on Queen Anne Hill, making digital flames out of her rage. The more I sold, the more offers came in. Licensing, merchandising, invitations to exclusive NFT showcases. I declined most of them. I didn't want to be visible. Not yet. But I kept every email, every contract, every proof of transaction. I had money now, real money. More than I ever imagined. So I started Astor Fund. Officially, it was a boutique investment vehicle designed to support emerging digital artists. In reality, it was a firewall. A place to store my earnings under a name no one connected to me. I registered it in Delaware, hired a firm in New York to handle the legal structure, and opened a private brokerage account. With the first $200,000, I bought tech stocks. With the next $500,000, I started acquiring quiet shares of Prescott and King through proxy firms. Nothing large enough to trigger alerts, just little pieces. Slivers. No one noticed. Why would they? I was still Camille, still the woman who organized floral arrangements and hosted brunches and thanked the chef for the catering Judith ordered behind my back. Brandon didn't see me anymore. He barely looked up when I walked into the room. His phone was always in his hand, his laptop open, his voice sharp when he spoke to staff, but lazy when he spoke to me. "You spend too much time upstairs," he said once while sipping bourbon. "You should get out more. Do something useful." "I'm working on something," I said. He laughed. "Please don't tell me you're still playing with that tablet." I said nothing, just walked away. A week later, I sold a piece called Tethered for $350,000 to a collector in Singapore. It was a dark piece, all jagged edges and smoldering light. It made the rounds on every art blog that month. One even called it a masterpiece of modern feminine rage. I took that money and bought a larger stake in the firm that handled Prescott and King's vendor contracts. By the end of the quarter, I had controlling interest in 2 of their preferred subcontractors. All on paper. All legal. It had taken me nearly 10 years, but I had built something real. Not just an art brand. A position. A shield. A weapon. I wasn't sure yet how I would use it. But I knew the moment was coming. It came on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in champagne flutes and faux laughter. Judith had organized yet another garden party, the kind where no one really eats the canapés and everyone competes over who can tell the most exclusive vacation story. The house was buzzing with florists and servers before noon. I wasn't asked to help, just expected to float around and smile like the host's silent ornament. I wore a pale blue dress, simple cotton, no label, no structure. It was soft and breathable. I had chosen it because I liked how it felt against my skin, not how it looked in photos. That was my first mistake, apparently. Judith greeted me at the foot of the grand staircase like a curator unveiling an underwhelming piece of art. "You're wearing that?" she asked, her voice too sweet, too public. I nodded. "It's comfortable." She gave me the tight-lipped smile she reserved for waitstaff and ex-daughters-in-law. "Just stay near the orchids, dear. They could use the company. I held my breath and stepped outside. The backyard looked like a magazine spread. Strings of white lights arched between the cherry trees and linen-covered tables gleamed with crystal. The women Judith had collected over the years, retired socialites, board chairs, wives of tech moguls, were already forming clusters, clutching cocktails and stories, sharpened like knives. I moved quietly, as I always did. Smiled, nodded, said the right things. Until one of them turned to me, eyes sweeping over my dress. "Oh my," she said with a tilt of her head, voice carrying just loud enough for the group to hear. "I almost asked you to get me another glass of wine. You look like the help trying on the ladies' clothes." Laughter followed. The kind that stings more because it's masked as polite. I felt my neck burn. I met her eyes and smiled thinly. Must be the lighting. Judith laughed too, a full-bodied laugh she rarely gave even Brandon. That was the part that made something inside me shift for good. Not the insult, not the laughter, but the fact that Judith enjoyed it. That she wanted me humiliated. In her mind, I wasn't just beneath her. I was disposable. I stayed for another hour, not because I had to, but because I wanted them to see I wouldn't flinch. I walked through the crowd, offered polite comments on centerpieces and weather forecasts, and took mental snapshots of every face that looked at me like I was furniture with a stain they hadn't authorized. By sunset, the guests were gone and Judith was inside reviewing flower arrangements for an upcoming gala. I walked upstairs, stripped out of the blue dress, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the back of my closet. Then I opened my laptop and called Malcolm. "It's time," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "I'm ready." We met 2 days later in a quiet office above a bookstore in Fremont. Malcolm had already drafted the documents. A new series of silent acquisitions routed through Astra Fund and a third-party investment group he had helped establish. The goal was clear. Gain controlling interest in the 3 vendor firms Prescott and King relied on most. It wouldn't give me Brandon's title, but it would give me power. The kind that can't be taken away with a signature. "We can finalize this within 3 weeks, Malcolm said, sliding the papers across the desk. "But once this is in motion, there's no walking it back." I signed. I walked out of that building feeling taller than I had in years. The air was sharp, crisp, full of movement. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was shifting the ground beneath them. Back at the house, Brandon didn't notice a thing. He had just come back from another Miami trip and was in the kitchen complaining about a broken wine fridge. I made a note of the delivery confirmation for a gift Sienna had signed for. A silver watch, $14,000. Charged to a corporate expense account labeled client retention. That night, I painted a new piece. It was unlike anything I'd done before. Bold, jagged, pulsing with heat. I called it the Stallion. It sold in less than 6 hours for $190,000. The buyer was anonymous, but I recognized the crypto tag. They had purchased 3 other pieces under different aliases. I created a folder named Leverage and placed all documentation inside. Asset transfers, artwork, sales, fund movement, shell acquisitions. I made copies. Uploaded one to an encrypted drive. Mailed another to a P.O. box under a name no one knew. The next morning, Judith called to ask if I would assist with a luncheon for a visiting senator's wife. "I'm not available," I said. She paused. "Is something wrong?" I smiled as I looked over the email confirming our final vendor acquisition. Not at all. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was lying. I was no longer pretending to be what they needed. I was building an exit. Not the kind with tiers and boxes, but with documents and equity. Let them think I was still theirs. Soon they'd learn the difference between owning a house and owning the ground it stands on. The courthouse smelled like lemon disinfectant and old wood. Cameras lined the steps outside, voices humming in microphones, names whispered in low excitement. Brandon Prescott's divorce had made the news the moment I filed. Not because anyone cared about me, but because Brandon was the face of a multi-million-dollar development empire, and scandal made for good viewership. I walked in wearing black, no jewelry, no makeup. My hair pulled back, simple. Quiet. Judith sat in the front row, already wrapped in pearls and smugness, surrounded by women who used to laugh at my quiet clothes and empty title. I felt their eyes sweep over me. I didn't flinch. The judge called the room to order. Brandon sat across the aisle, crisp suit, clean shave, flanked by his attorney and publicist. He didn't look at me. I didn't expect him to. His lawyer opened with pleasantries. He spoke of Brandon's contributions to the city, his business acumen, his philanthropic efforts. There were nods from the gallery. I waited. Then came the twist. The lawyer turned toward me and said I had made no significant contributions during the marriage. That I had no independent income. That the lifestyle I enjoyed was funded solely by Brandon. He spoke in numbers, spreadsheets, vacations. I never took jewelry I never wore. I sat still. Finally, Brandon stood. He wasn't supposed to speak yet, but he rarely followed rules. You know what it's like, he said, his voice relaxed and rehearsed. To live with someone who never asks for more. It's like having a workhorse. Easy to ride, easy to feed, and they never wander off. Just stable, predictable. Not flashy, not demanding. He smiled, waiting for the room to laugh. And it did. A ripple of polite chuckles rising into louder amusement. Judith didn't laugh at first. She looked at me, then at Brandon, then finally let herself grin. A slow, satisfied thing. My stomach turned, but I kept my face calm. I folded my hands and looked down, letting them believe they had silenced me. The lawyer leaned into it. He called me dependent, unambitious. A housewife with hobbies. He said the prenup made clear I had no claim to Brandon's estate and that my attempt to fight it was a waste of court time. He called my petition a desperate play by a woman unwilling to accept the end of a generous arrangement. More nods. More whispers. Somewhere in the room, a camera clicked. I wondered how I looked on the live stream. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood slowly. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, I would like to present evidence. Brandon laughed. Not loudly, but enough. His lawyer smirked. Judith shifted in her seat, arms crossed like a teacher waiting to correct a student. Malcolm walked forward from the bench behind me. He held a small black USB in his hand, handed it to the court clerk, and stepped back. The judge nodded. Proceed. The courtroom screen flickered to life. I walked toward the front and stood beside the display. The first image appeared. A digital painting, dark, moody, electric. Then another, then another. Faces. Wings. Chains breaking. A woman walking through fire. Each one carried a small signature in the corner. Astra Wilder. The room changed. I kept speaking. These works, I said, are mine. Created between the years 2017 and 2024. Each one sold under a verified pseudonym. Each sale logged and traceable. Every payment legally transferred into accounts owned by me under the name Astra Fund. Brandon sat back in his chair, arms crossing tightly now. His lawyer's mouth opened slightly. I showed account statements, licensing contracts, magazine features, international sales logs, auction reports. All under Astra Wilder. All linked to me. I kept my voice calm. Controlled. While my husband traveled, I worked. While I was dismissed as a housewife, I built a portfolio that now funds artists across the world. Every asset tied to Astra Wilder is mine. Every dollar is documented. Every purchase legal. I turned to the judge. I am not requesting half of Mr. Prescott's estate. I have no need for it. I paused, letting the silence breathe. What I seek is recognition. And the truth. The judge looked down at the screen, then at the USB. He asked if the defense had any objections. Brandon's lawyer hesitated. We weren't aware of this, Your Honor. We request time to review. Denied, the judge replied. This evidence is admissible, and it appears you had ample opportunity to inquire into Mrs. Prescott's financial activity. I glanced at Brandon. He was no longer smiling. Judith looked frozen. I returned to my seat, my legs steady, my breath even. It was just the beginning. The next slide appeared on the screen, and with it my voice grew stronger. Here's a list of completed sales under the name Astra Wilder, I said, motioning to the figures that now glowed in sharp contrast above the courtroom. Each transaction is verifiable through blockchain history, each purchase tied to my work, and each dollar earned transferred into legal accounts under my name. Not Brandon's, not Prescott and King's mine. The numbers were staggering. 275 pieces sold in 6 years, multiple works reaching six-figure bids. One recent sale clocking at $640,000 to a private collector in Tokyo. The room had fallen into a thick silence. Even the bailiff had stopped shifting. I clicked again. Here are my contracts, I continued. Licensing agreements with music labels in Los Angeles. Visual design partnerships with global ad agencies. This one, I gestured, is an exclusive NFT collection commissioned by a New York fashion house last year. It sold out in under 48 hours. Then came the Forbes slide. A quote from a recent feature article titled "The Hidden Women of Digital Art." The writer didn't know who I was, but they called Astra Wilder one of the most important visual voices of the decade. The quote hung there in the air. Her art is rage wrapped in elegance, a rebellion disguised as beauty. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet gasp. I didn't turn to see who. I am Astra Wilder, I said clearly. I created every piece. Every line, every light, every fragment of fire. While Brandon dismissed me, while Judith told me to focus on flower arrangements, I was building a life that didn't need their permission. Judith had gone pale. Her fingers clutched her purse like it might anchor her to something real. Brandon finally leaned forward. That's not possible, he muttered. But I wasn't done. I turned back to the screen and advanced again. These are the registered crypto wallets tied to Astra Wilder. Here I showed the unique identifiers. And here is the legal registration for Astra Fund, the entity that holds and manages all related income. I am the sole owner, sole director, and sole beneficiary. I didn't ask for this hearing to beg for scraps, I said calmly. I'm not here to argue about allowances. I'm here to state for the record that I never needed what Brandon built. I built something else. Something bigger. Something mine. The judge adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the printed report his clerk had handed him. Is the evidence presented in order, he asked. Yes, Your Honor, Malcolm replied. All authenticated and time-stamped. Additional copies have been submitted to the court and opposing counsel. Brandon's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we request a recess to review the material. Request denied, the judge said, eyes still on the screen. You had ample time for discovery. This court accepts the evidence as submitted. Brandon looked like he was going to stand but thought better of it. He slumped back, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. I could have stopped there. I had proven my financial independence. I had dismantled the narrative of the dependent wife. But I wasn't finished. Your Honor, I said, my voice lower now but still clear. There is a second component I would like to present. The judge tilted his head slightly. Please continue, Mrs. Prescott. I nodded and turned back to the screen. A new file opened. This is a copy of a real estate transaction dated May 2023, I said. It shows the purchase of a property located at 647 West Highland Drive, Ive. A 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom home purchased for $4.7 million. The funds were transferred from Astra Fund directly. The deed is in my name, solely. That is the residence Brandon and I currently live in. I paused, letting that settle. When he called me a workhorse, he said I was easy to feed, easy to house. But I own the house. A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand for silence, but even he looked shaken. Brandon's mouth moved, but no words came out. His attorney leaned in, whispering quickly, but he waved him off. Judith sat back, her face frozen. A single bead of sweat rolled down the side of her cheek, disappearing into her neckline. I turned away from the screen and faced the judge. All of this is documented. All of it was legal. I am not contesting the prenup. I'm not asking for a share of Brandon's company. I don't want spousal support. I have more than enough. But the truth matters. And for 10 years I was treated like someone who brought nothing into the marriage. Like I should be grateful for scraps. Like I was lucky to be tolerated. I looked over at Brandon then. You thought I was invisible. You thought silence meant weakness. But I didn't disappear. I created something you couldn't control. He didn't look away. The courtroom sat in complete stillness. Even the reporters had stopped typing. I stepped back, folded my hands in front of me, and returned to my seat. The judge cleared his throat. "We will take a brief recess to reconvene in 20 minutes. The gavel struck once. I didn't move. I sat with my spine straight, eyes forward as the room emptied around me. The second part was coming. Under the courtroom lights, I turned back to the screen and loaded the next file without hesitation. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't tremble. I had rehearsed this moment so many times that it had become muscle memory. But now it was real, and nothing about it felt like a performance. It felt like truth finally being allowed to speak. "Your Honor," I began, "I would like to now address the matter of the marital residence currently located at 647 West Highland Drive." The gallery leaned forward. Even the judge sat a little straighter. "This house, which has been referred to publicly and in Mr. Prescott's own press materials as the Prescott Estate, was purchased on May 12, 2023 for $4.7 million. The payment was made in full with no mortgage through a wire transfer sourced from a corporate wallet belonging to Astor Fund." I clicked to the next slide. The screen showed the official closing statement from the real estate firm, the routing details, and the name on the title. My name, Camille Prescott. I continued. Mr. Prescott was not involved in this transaction. He did not fund, authorize, or co-sign any document related to the purchase. The property was acquired entirely through assets generated by Astor Fund, which I have already established is wholly owned and operated by me under the pseudonym Astor Wilder. I advanced to the next screen, this one showing the blockchain transaction record. The wallet ID matched the financial statements previously entered into evidence. The funds originated from a verified crypto wallet tied directly to Astor Fund's registered accounts in New York. Each cent of this transaction was earned through the legal sale and licensing of my artwork and was never commingled with community property. I turned toward the judge, letting the screen hang in silence behind me. "As outlined in our prenuptial agreement, which remains binding and fully enforceable, any independently earned income or property acquired during the marriage remains the separate property of the earning spouse, unless commingled." Brandon's lawyer stood clearly agitated. "Your Honor, the defense has not had sufficient time to verify the authenticity of this documentation. We request a delay to assess the legitimacy of these claims." The judge didn't even glance up as he spoke. "Request denied. The documentation appears thorough and professionally validated. Your team was given the opportunity during discovery to investigate all financial assets. That time has passed." Malcolm stood and added, "We're prepared to provide not only the notarized deed but the certified wire receipt, escrow closing file, and the recorded title transfer document showing Mrs. Prescott as the sole legal owner. All submitted to the court in accordance with pre-trial procedure." I looked toward Brandon then. He hadn't spoken since I'd resumed. His face had gone from smug to flushed to hollow. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something again, but he just kept staring at the floor. I walked back to the center of the room. This house, the one Brandon called his in interviews, the one where Judith held parties and told me not to move the pillows unless I had approval, was never his. It was never theirs. It was mine. I had purchased it in full using funds I earned alone while being called a burden, a dependent, a workhorse. The irony is almost poetic. There was no laughter this time. The judge asked calmly, "Mr. Prescott, do you have any documentation showing financial contribution to the purchase of 647 West Highland Drive?" Brandon's voice was quiet, raw. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Then, the record will reflect that the property is to remain the exclusive, separate asset of Mrs. Prescott, not subject to division under the terms of the marital contract." Judith let out a low, involuntary sound. A muffled gasp, like someone trying to swallow back a scream. I turned to look at her. Her face had lost its color. The pearls around her neck sat heavy now like a collar. She shook her head. "That house is ours," she whispered, mostly to herself. I took a breath and said the words I had waited 10 years to speak. "The house you've entertained and judged me from, dismissed me within, was bought by the woman you never saw. The one you laughed at. The one you thought was lucky to be there." Judith stood halfway as if to object, but then slowly sank back into her seat. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't make it worse. The judge cleared his throat. We will enter this into the official property ledger and move forward accordingly. Unless the defense has additional objections, Brandon's lawyer glanced at him, then sat back down without saying a word. I walked back to my seat. My heels didn't click. My pace was even. My hands remained at my sides. It wasn't anger carrying me anymore. It was clarity. Brandon leaned slightly toward his attorney. I didn't hear what he said, but I saw the panic start to creep into his features. His empire was crumbling faster than he could stop it. And still I wasn't done. As I sat, I reached into my folder, pulled out one more document, and placed it gently on the desk beside me. Because the house wasn't the only thing he never really owned. I rose again, this time holding a smaller folder in my hand. My pace was calm, almost slow, as I returned to the center of the courtroom. I didn't need the screen anymore. The facts were no longer just images. They were weight. Your Honor, I said, I would now like to present the final set of documents. I handed the folder to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Inside were 12 pages. Each one a nail. These are internal transfers conducted through shell companies affiliated with Prescott and King. They show the diversion of funds over a 3-year period beginning in 2021. Most notably transfers directed to a private account held in the name of Sienna Locke. At the mention of her name, Brandon's head snapped up. The judge raised an eyebrow. The total diverted over that period, I continued, amounts to just over $2.4 million. The transfers were fragmented, disguised as consultant fees and off-ledger marketing contracts. However, the destination remained consistent. I walked slowly to the defense table, stopping several feet from where Brandon sat. The account is registered in Miami at a private bank favored by international investors seeking discretion. What makes this relevant to today's proceedings, Your Honor, is that the funds used to pay for a penthouse registered under a corporate subsidiary of Prescott and King were drawn directly from that account. Brandon's lawyer stood. This is speculative, Your Honor. These documents haven't been authenticated in discovery. Malcolm stood calmly behind me. They were authenticated. Copies were submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office on April 5, 2024. The originals are part of an active investigation. The room stirred. The judge looked sharply at the gallery. Is a representative of the U.S. Attorney's Office present? A tall man near the back of the courtroom stood. Square shoulders. Federal badge visible at his hip. Yes, Your Honor. Assistant U.S. Attorney Paul Whitman. These documents were received in full 3 months ago. Our office has been conducting a joint investigation with the Financial Crimes Division. Charges may include corporate fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. The air changed. It wasn't tension now, it was fear. Brandon stood so fast his chair toppled backward. You lying snake, he shouted across the room. This is all fake. You set me up. Court officers moved quickly. The judge slammed his gavel. Mr. Prescott, you are out of order. Sit down or you will be removed from this courtroom. She's nothing, Brandon spat. She was nothing before me. The judge signaled the bailiff. Remove him. 2 officers approached. Brandon resisted at first, jerking away, cursing under his breath. But he wasn't a man built for handcuffs. He crumbled quickly. Judith remained seated, silent and still. Her eyes fixed on a point on the floor, like she could fall through it if she stared hard enough. I turned back to the bench. Your Honor, I said, I would like to submit one final document. This is the current ownership breakdown of Prescott and King. As of June 20, 2024, Astra Fund has acquired 51% of the company's preferred voting shares. I am the sole director of Astra Fund. The courtroom was completely silent. I paused, letting the reality settle. There is no conflict of interest. The purchases were made legally through approved channels with documented funds from a registered investment entity. There was no insider trading. Every acquisition was compliant with SEC regulations. But it does change one thing. The judge looked up from the paper, his voice calm. What does it change? Mrs. Prescott, control. I own controlling interest in Prescott and King. I stepped back. No dramatics. No smile. Just the plain truth. Judith let out a short, sharp breath. Her pearl bracelet slipped down her wrist as her hand trembled. She reached for her purse but didn't open it. The judge tapped his pen once on the arm of his chair, then turned to the court reporter. Let the record reflect that Mrs. Camille Prescott is the legal controlling shareholder of Prescott and King as of the date submitted. This information shall be cross-referenced with the ongoing federal investigation. He looked to Whitman. Will your office be issuing any additional statements? Not at this time, Your Honor, but the court can expect formal notice of indictments in the coming weeks. The judge nodded. Thank you. I returned to my seat. My legs were steady. My breath even. Brandon's chair remained empty. His echoes still lingered in the air like smoke after a match is struck. I glanced down at the small notebook I had carried in my handbag. I had filled its pages slowly, quietly, methodically. Notes. Transfers. Names. Dates. I had recorded everything. Since the beginning, and now the record was public. 1 week later, I stood outside the courthouse again, this time without the cameras flashing in my face. The media had moved on to other scandals, newer dramas, but inside, behind closed doors, the final ruling was handed down. The judge's voice was steady as he read from the bench. After reviewing all presented evidence, he said this court finds that Mrs. Camille Prescott is the sole legal owner of the residence, located at 647 West Highland Drive, purchased with independently earned income and protected under the terms of the prenuptial agreement. He paused only briefly before continuing. Additionally, the court recognizes the full enforceability of said prenuptial agreement, which clearly states that assets acquired individually by either party are not subject to division. Therefore, Mrs. Prescott retains full ownership of all earnings accounts, investments, and intellectual property derived from her work as Astor Wilder, including all assets held within Astor Fund. I didn't move. I just listened. The judge went on, outlining the civil consequences first. Brandon would receive no claim to any portion of my holdings. He had filed for partial stake in the artwork and in Astra Fund's investment accounts, citing marital support and implied partnership. All of it was denied. Then came the criminal consequences. In light of the financial documents presented and in coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office, this court will refer the matter of Mr. Prescott's financial conduct for criminal prosecution. Charges may include tax evasion, wire fraud, corporate misrepresentation, and money laundering. I glanced across the aisle. Brandon sat with his hands clenched under the table. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on documentation showing unreported income and undocumented payments through company subsidiaries, the court recommends that Miss Judith Prescott be investigated for failure to report taxable benefits. The Department of Revenue will be notified regarding undisclosed gifts and financial transfers totaling over $900,000 between 2020 and 2023. Judith didn't speak. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her pearls looked heavy now, dragging down her neckline like chains. And finally, the judge turned toward me. As of today, this court affirms the legitimacy of Mrs. Prescott's acquisition of controlling interest in Prescott and King. Her position as majority shareholder and legal managing partner is to be recognized and recorded. All relevant documents have been reviewed and authenticated. Malcolm placed his hand gently on the back of my chair. A quiet signal. It was done. As the ruling concluded, a marshal stepped into the courtroom. He approached Brandon, calmly leaned in, and whispered something. Brandon's face blanched. He stood slowly, but he didn't fight this time. The moment the judge struck the gavel, the marshal placed him under arrest. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, and for the first time, the man who once towered over boardrooms and belittled my dreams was led quietly out through the side door. The courtroom didn't applaud. It didn't gasp. It was just still. I stood and gathered my things. No entourage, no headlines, just me. Outside, the sky had shifted. That soft Seattle gray light spread across the pavement like a calm breath. A reporter stood across the street holding a microphone but not approaching. Her cameraman just filmed quietly as I walked to the black sedan waiting at the curb. Later that day, headlines started to spread across the news cycle. Workhorse owns the empire. I saw it on every screen. Talk shows, blogs, even financial journals. The phrase stuck. It was everywhere by nightfall. Judith released a statement through a publicist that same afternoon. She claimed no knowledge of her son's misconduct. She referred to me as her former daughter-in-law with whom she had limited contact. It was short, cold, almost clinical. Within 72 hours, the Department of Revenue had already opened an audit on her. She stopped appearing in public. Brandon was denied bail. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing joyous about what happened. Nothing clean or triumphant. It was justice. It was what happens when you spend years documenting every moment someone tries to erase you and you refuse to be erased. The following week, I walked through the door of the office building I now owned 60% of. The gold lettering on the wall still read Prescott and King, but that would change soon. The staff was quiet as I passed through the halls. Some nodded, some looked away. Others looked at me like they were seeing something they hadn't before. Not a wife. Not a woman behind a man. But the architect of everything they didn't see coming. I stood in the conference room where Brandon once held court. I placed my notebook on the table and opened it to the first page. The ink had faded from the earliest entries, but I could still read the handwriting. January 10, 2014. Prenup signed. Addendum submitted by Malcolm Green. No objection. It was all there. Every note. Every receipt. Every lie I turned into leverage. That day, I didn't feel like the workhorse anymore. I felt like the one holding the reins. Judith's name disappeared from the Cascade Ladies Guild roster exactly 6 days after the final ruling. No formal announcement. Just a quiet removal from the website and a cancellation of her scheduled luncheon in Bellevue. The chair next to the president's seat sat empty for 3 events in a row until finally it was filled by someone younger, someone with no scandal clinging to their heels. Her bank accounts were frozen that same week. Not all of them. Just the ones that mattered. The personal account she used for monthly transfers from Prescott and King's marketing subsidiary. The trust fund Brandon had quietly shifted into her name. The offshore account linked to a consulting firm that had never held a meeting. All flagged. All frozen. She tried to play the victim. Released a statement through a crisis PR firm in Portland. It described her as unaware, misled, emotionally devastated. She wore black in the staged photos. Wrote about betrayal in an op-ed submitted to the Seattle Times. It was rejected. 2 weeks later, one of the same magazines that had once featured her as Seattle's silver matriarch ran a 3-page exposé on her role in facilitating Brandon's off-book transfers. They even published emails, thinly veiled threats to accounting staff, backdated memos to justify expenses, notes about keeping Camille in the dark. Her picture on the cover looked grainy, stripped of elegance. The headline simply read, "The Empire Behind the Curtain." I didn't read the full article. I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. Sienna, on the other hand, didn't speak a word publicly. The court sentenced her to 18 months of house arrest followed by 3 years of probation. Her fine totaled just over $2.1 million. She pled down to avoid prison time. I had no interest in seeing her jailed. She was just a piece of the machine Brandon had built. A willing piece, but not the architect. Her apartment was now listed for sale, her name scrubbed from the firm's website. She would never work in finance again. That much was certain. While they unraveled, I opened the doors to something I had nearly forgotten: my studio. It sat untouched for months while the case moved through court. Now it felt like walking into a chapel. Light poured in through the high windows on Queen Anne Hill. The scent of old wood ink and something warm returned to me the moment I stepped in. I let the silence settle, then I began. I didn't try to make it perfect. I just let the brush move. My hands knew what to do even when my heart still carried smoke. The first painting I finished in that space was called Return. The second was called Unbridled. By fall, the exhibit was ready. Ascension opened in downtown Seattle at a converted warehouse gallery that had once rejected my portfolio 3 times in the early years. Now they begged to host the first solo exhibition by Astra Wilder. The opening night was full. Press, collectors, former doubters, women in sleek black coats, young artists with red notebooks. Some I recognized from parties they never acknowledged me at before. Others looked starstruck and unsure whether to speak. The centerpiece was hung on the far wall, illuminated from above. It was massive, over 6 feet tall. A single horse, its coat aflame in gold and copper, tearing through a broken halter. Its eyes burned forward, unflinching. Its mouth open, not in fear but defiance. The title etched on the bottom right corner read Ascension. A journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle approached me near the wine table. She was young, sharp, holding a recorder and a printed list of questions. "Your story has made waves," she said. "The trial, the headlines, the artwork. Everyone's talking about it. About you. I only have one question that hasn't been answered yet." I waited. "Do you hate them?" I looked past her, past the crowd, to the wall where the horse burned free. "No," I said. "I don't hate them." She blinked, surprised. I won. The words weren't loud, but they were final. Hate requires energy. Weight. I had carried all of that for too long. They tried to trap me in their version of who I was supposed to be. Wife. Hostess. Help. Workhorse. But now they were the ones watching from outside. Judith, I heard, had retreated to her second home in Walla Walla. Smaller, older, far from the view she used to boast about. No more galas, no more councils. Just a woman with a name that once carried weight and now only echoed with scandal. The chair she used to claim at every table now sat empty. And no one was asking when she'd come back. The morning air was sharp and quiet as I stepped out onto the balcony. From here I could see the curve of the Sound, the cranes near the port, the glass reflections of downtown. Seattle was different in the early light, stripped of noise and pretense. It breathed slower. So did I. It had been 1 year. 1 year since the ruling. Since the cameras vanished. Since Brandon was led out of that courtroom in cuffs and the last signature went through confirming my legal control over Prescott and King. Astor Fund had grown beyond anything I imagined when I sketched out its structure in the back of that black notebook. We had funded 67 artists, opened 2 residency programs, and launched a national grant initiative for women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse. Every week I read stories from women who had been told they were burdens, who were forced to account for every dollar spent while their husbands moved money behind shell companies and charming smiles. They sent thank you notes, they sent paintings, they sent hope. Brandon's sentencing came in late spring. 15 years with eligibility for parole after 10. The courtroom was half empty that day. He didn't look at me once. His attorney read a prepared statement. The judge didn't respond to it. No one applauded. It wasn't a victory to be cheered, it was a consequence that finally arrived. Judith moved shortly after the indictment against her was dropped in exchange for full cooperation and back taxes. She sold the condo in Capitol Hill, the one she once told me was for entertaining dignitaries. She bought a house in a small town in Oregon, far enough from everything she used to know that no one would ask questions. Her name hadn't appeared in a headline in months. Mine had. A few weeks ago, I stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., accepting an award from the National Endowment for the Arts. They called me a pioneer. A force. They listed accomplishments and grants and pieces held in collections across 3 continents. I just stood there in a black suit, hair tied back, fingers still ink-stained from a painting I finished that morning. Later, in the quiet green room, a reporter sat across from me with a handheld mic and a nervous laugh. She was young. Eager. "You've been called many things," she said, flipping her notes. "An artist, a businesswoman, a symbol of something bigger. Is there one title that means the most to you?" I looked down at my hands, then out the window behind her. There was a moment of silence. The kind that asks to be filled. "The man who once called me a workhorse," I said softly. "I own his stable now." She blinked. Then smiled. Then hit save on the recording. The quote went viral within hours. I didn't post about it. I didn't need to. That afternoon, I returned to the studio changed into worn jeans, tied up my sleeves, and went back to work. The canvas in front of me was half done, a blend of stormlight and sky. A single figure stood at the edge, holding nothing but reins in her hand, facing forward. The rest would come. I've been asked if I feel angry, bitter, vengeful. The truth is I don't carry those weights anymore. I set them down the day I walked into that courtroom and spoke with a voice they never expected to hear. I didn't build a life to destroy someone else's. I built one because I needed to remember who I was. And who I had always been. Not a burden. Not a liability. Not background. But the main character in my own story. Sometimes it takes being underestimated to remember your strength. Sometimes the insult they throw at you becomes the fire that forges something untouchable. If you've ever been called small, quiet, forgettable, lazy, difficult, a problem, a placeholder, a workhorse, remember this. You're none of those things. You're potential waiting to be unleashed. And sometimes the best kind of revenge is simply to become everything they said you never could be. Have you ever been underestimated? Leave a comment, share your story, and subscribe to this channel for more voices like mine. You never know whose reins are about to be handed back.